So what we're doing in this video is creating an all-in-one armhole and neck facing. So what you've seen, or what you might have seen in other videos, is creating a neckline facing. It's exactly the same process that you would use to create a facing for an armhole. So in the same way, if you don't have a sleeve and you need to finish an armhole, you use a facing to finish and to stabilize the armhole, including using block fusing on your facing. So now we're going to show you how to create an all-in-one facing. So you might use that when you have a small strap over here, over the shoulder, and a scooping neckline or a low dropped armhole. So to do that, I'll use again my French dart bodice that I created earlier. So remembering we've got our seam allowances on, so we don't need to further add seam allowances to this. So I've got my paper on the fold and I'm placing my pattern piece right on that fold halfway, using the center front notches from the neck and the waist. And then I'll anchor that down so that I can trace around here. Alrighty, the first thing that we're going to do is to make an alteration to the armhole. This isn't essential, this is just to demonstrate how, as well as changing the neckline as we did in some previous videos, we can also change the shape of the armhole. So I'm going to bring the armhole up here 2 centimeters, and then I'm going to drop it by 3 centimeters. So remembering that whatever alteration we make to the front of the pattern, we also need to do that to the back. So I'm going to use my ruler to roughly follow the shape of this armhole and then shape it as we come down the curve. So sort of bringing it down like this, bringing it in a little bit there, and then scooping it around here. Now that's very rough. I'm going to use my French curve to create some slightly smoother lines. Like that. So I'm pretty happy with the shape of that armhole now. Now I'm going to transfer over here a single notch, and I'm not worrying about copying that position because the size of the armhole has completely changed now. Because we're creating an all-in-one facing for the armhole and the neckline, what that is telling us about the design is that it has no sleeves. So we need to change the seam allowance that we have on the armhole. Before we had 12mm seam allowance because that was going to be connected to a sleeve, but now we need 6mm because it will be bagged out with some facing. I already have 6mm on my neckline, so now we're putting 6mm seam allowance on the new armhole. transfer the notch over. Okay, and we'll cross out this line as a reminder that that's our old working line. If you were doing this in pencil, you would simply rub that out. So I've created the alteration to my front armhole, and now I'm going to do that same alteration to flow it through to the back. So with my back piece, I am using the block rather than using a pattern, which means I'm going to need to trace it and add seam allowances everywhere. So quickly tracing the block, making sure that I get all of the notches and the drill holes as I go around, and the shaping on the end of the darts. Okay, draw in the dart arms and extending them down to the seam allowance. Now I need to make sure that I make an armhole alteration that matches this one. So we've moved 2 centimeters from the stitching line. So 2 centimeters from the stitching line, which is the edge here, because I don't have seam allowance. And now I'm dropping it 3 centimeters down, just double checking that. Yep, that's 3 centimeters down, which is to here, and curving that around. And then using the French curve. Before I add seam allowance to that, I'm just going to double check my shoulder flow through and the side seam flow through. Make sure that I've got it all matching nicely. So here is my stitching line sitting on top of my stitching line, and I'll just draw that position for the dart in over there. And so the other arm of the dart is matching that point, and the flow through is working really nicely on the shoulder. So my stitching line is lined up with my stitching line. Okay, now that I've checked the flow through of the shoulder, I need to now check the flow through of the side seam. So what I need along here is to mark my seam allowance so that I'm checking from the right position. Okay, coming over here, lining up the seam allowance with the stitching line. I'm going to mark in the position of that dart, which is here, not this one, and then have a look up. Okay, so now the upper arm of my dart is sitting on the stitching line on the side seam, and I can see that I'm out by about 2 mils. So I'm going to drop that line down so that it matches the front, and then bring that new curve down to that new position there. So now I've checked the flow through, I'm ready to put my seam allowance and labelling on. So 6 mils on the armhole. Okay, we also need to remember to move the drill holes away from the end of the dart. So draw a line down the centre of the dart and move it 15 mils away. And the same for the little shoulder dart. 15 mils up. Okay, the grain line, as we remember, is parallel with the centre back. Now we are ready to to cut both of these pieces and label them. Before we do that, we're going to create our facings. So I'm going to start with the back facing. Starting up here. Now, as I've said before, depending whether you're using a thick paper or a thin paper, I'm using a thin paper so I can place it on top. I'm going to trace from the center back around the neck, marking the stitching line. And here to the dart. Now we're going to close the dart. Rather than including a seam or a dart in our facing, we're going to eliminate that by closing it like this. So I've rotated from the end of the dart and I've placed the first dart arm on top of the second, and my shoulder is now in line. And remember to trace your new line and not the original one. And I've run out of a little bit of room down here, so I'll pop some masking tape on. Placing that back in line, and I can finish tracing that side seam now. Now we have the outline of the shoulder. We've eliminated the shoulder dart from our centre back, our stitching lines, and the 6mm stitching line and the 12mm seam allowance on the side seam. So we're going to drop our back facing down, let's say 8 centimetres. So marker point 8 centimetres down centre back and 5 centimetres at the side seam. So now instead of creating a facing that comes up to the neck and then around the armhole like that, if you did that, you would end up with a shaping that was almost impossible to sew. So if you can follow the line as we do when we're creating separate facings, you would get a shape that looks a little bit like this V, and this would be impossible to finish. You wouldn't be able to get an overlocker into that point. So what we do with these two sections, we flatten the back, the centre back facing, and then we curve it down to the armhole. So first what I'll do is mark on the seam allowance of the armhole all the way down. So that's 6 mils. So we've got the 6 mils and the 5 centimetre mark, and we'll follow that 5 centimetre measurement around here. And we take it up to a similar level as the centre back. And there, instead of bringing it up, we're going to curve it down to meet that junction smoothly, and ending up with a line that your overlocker will be comfortable with sewing. So now we have our new line down here for the back neck facing, and we'll cross out that line and that line. Obviously, if you're working in pencil at home, you'll be able to rub those lines out to make it clearer. Now our seam allowance, sorry, not our seam allowance, our grain line is following from the back of the garment, which is following centre back. So here is our grain line. Now I'm going to move to the front to create the front neck facing before we double check them all, cut them all out and finish the labelling. Okay, I'm going to place my folded paper underneath my original pattern and have the two folds in line with each other. Then place a weight on it and trace around the neckline. The armhole. And I'm also going to trace the stitching line of the armhole. And the side seam. Okay, don't forget to trace your single notches to indicate the front and the stitching line there. Now I have enough information to start creating my front facing. Okay, that's my cut line and this is my armhole stitching line. So underneath the arm on the side seam we have marked 5 centimeters down from the stitching line. So I'll copy that across. At the center front, 5 centimeters is also adequate. So we've got these 2 points and we're going to bring them around and join them like that. So I'm going to follow the stitching line of the front armhole. And then use the French curve to make this final join. The other thing to look out for when you're creating a front facing for a garment or even a back facing, it's just good to be aware of the position of the darts. So if you can avoid any bust darts or areas where there's shaping being created, then that will help your garment to sit better on the body. Alrighty, so we are now ready to cut out our pieces and finalize the labeling. So I finished labeling, cutting out and notching. You can see my front piece, cut oneself, and my front facing, cut oneself plus block fusing. So that's matching nicely. Over here on the back, it looks a little bit strange, and that's because we've eliminated this dart under here. So the neckline and the center back is matching. Then if we close this dart, just roughly, we get an idea that the actual facing is sitting quite nicely. We've just got this little kick up here to make way for the dart and the shaping that's happening underneath here. So we have cut 1 pair self for the back, and we've got cut 1 pair self plus block fusing for the back facing, and we've moved our drill holes away from the end of our darts.